Part 2 of this lecture discusses paleontology, which is the study of fossils and the fossil record. Paleontology is used to learn about the history of life on Earth and also to understand geologic history. There are 3 steps in terms of forming fossils, also known as fossilization. First is the death of an organism in an anoxic environment to produce decomposition that is very slow. Second is rapid burial, which means that the organism has been buried before disintegrating completely. And third is the presence of hard parts. Soft body parts for organisms decay rapidly, whereas hard parts take longer and are much easier to preserve. On the photos on the right, we have photos of several fossils, whether in situ or in collections at museums. There are several stages in fossilization, and we take the example of a dinosaur. So first, the dinosaur may have left footprints in the mud, it has passed away, and then its soft body parts have disintegrated. Then it has been buried by sediment and organic material, and having the water level rise to leave an environment without oxygen. More sediment accumulates, and gradually the bones begin to fossilize. And then over time, after that sedimentary unit, which encases the fossil, has been uplifted and eroded, individuals may happen upon or dig out the particular fossil. There are several different types of fossils depending on the method of preservation, which include frozen or dried bodies, body fossils preserved in amber or tar, preserved or replaced bones, teeth, or shells, molds and casts, carbonized impressions, per-mineralized organisms, trace fossils, and chemical fossils. We will discuss each. Frozen or dried body fossils are unique because, in this case, whole bodies may be preserved, and these types of fossils are generally young by geological standards because they are often encased in ice. One example is this baby mammoth found in Siberia from 37,000 years ago, which has its entire body, including skin and muscular tissue, intact. Body fossils can be preserved in amber or tar. One example would be this mosquito embedded in amber, and then on the right we have a giant sloth from the La Brea tar pits in California, United States. More often, fossils get preserved as replaced bones, teeth, or shells. So these hard parts of invertebrates, such as fossil shells, are the most likely to be preserved because they take the longest to decay. So in this limestone, for example, we have casts of brachiopod shells. Molds and casts form when sediments compact around an object, which later dissolves and leaves a cavity that is later filled by other sediments. So in this case, we have a cast of Archaeopteryx, or excuse me, a mold of the fossil Archaeopteryx. Carbonized impressions are flattened molds that are created when soft or semi-soft organisms get preserved between layers of sediment. This often happens in the case of plant leaves. So here we have carbonized impressions of fern fronds in a shale. Per-mineralized organisms form when minerals are precipitated from groundwater that is seeped into pores or porous materials like wood and bone. So that's why we get petrified wood, which is no longer actually carbon. In this case, the carbon ions have been removed and replaced with silica ions, which is much harder. This also happens with shell material in limestones. Trace fossils are footprints, burrows, and other imprints left behind by ancient organisms. So one example is dinosaur tracks. Macrofossils are those fossils that are large enough to be seen with human eyes, whereas microfossils can only be seen with a microscope. And here we have a picture of microfossil plankton. Microfossils are often used in the oil and gas industry to identify units that are good source materials or reservoir materials for oil and gas hydrocarbons. We identify fossils or classify them using the same principles that we use to classify modern organisms. And this is mainly based on their form and shape, which is defined as their morphology. So examples of common invertebrates are on the right. Invertebrate indicates that the animal does not have a backbone. So we see trilobites, gastropods, bivalves, crinoids, ammonites, corals, and more. The concept of extinction arrives from understanding that we see animals and plants of a certain morphology in the fossil record at one point in time that are later to have disappeared. They do not exist in the fossil record or on modern Earth. So at the time that this was proposed by Cuvier in the 17 and 1800s, it was revolutionary, but it is fully accepted today in the scientific community. William Smith was a purveyor of this idea called fossil succession. This was the recognition that distinct rock layers can be recognized based on their fossil assemblages. Each species will have existed during a defined period of time that may or may not continue until the present. Certain fossils that are only present in very specific or small periods of time may be considered index fossils that help us identify units, rock units, and their ages globally. Study of the fossil record has allowed paleontologists to trace the history of life on Earth. But it's important to remember that the fossil record is incomplete and represents only a small number of the organisms that have lived. Many organisms may not be represented at all if their environment didn't allow for preservation. This is a concept called preservation bias. Despite this, it does allow us to trace the history of when species appeared and disappeared in the fossil record and the geological record. Now we combine our knowledge from relative dating and fossils to understand a concept called stratigraphy. So stratigraphy is just the sequences of rock layers that can be traced over fairly broad regions. Contacts are known as the boundaries between two rock formations, and a stratigraphic column is a chart that represents the order of formations and the relative thicknesses. So our example below is the Grand Canyon's exposed layers in a stratigraphic column. Often these stratigraphic columns have absolute ages associated with them in addition to relative ages indicated by their order in the diagram. Unconformities represent periods of erosion rather than deposition in the geologic record. So unconformities are lines between or contacts between different formations, possibly of very distinct ages with large gaps in between. One example below is a sandstone deposited on an underlying siltstone and shale. There are several types of unconformities. An angular unconformity is where the rocks below are tilted at an angle to the younger overlying rocks. The rocks or beds below underwent some sort of alteration or tilting, with the new beds deposited at an angle to them on top. The picture below describes this, as does the picture in the previous slide. A nonconformity is when younger sedimentary rocks overlie older igneous or metamorphic rocks. So rather than having sedimentary on top of sedimentary rocks, we have sedimentary on top of igneous. A disconformity is where the sedimentary beds above and below the unconformity are parallel, but the contact between them represents a hiatus or a period of erosion rather than deposition. If we put the Grand Canyon on a stratigraphic column, the vertical scale represents thickness and patterns represent the different rock types. Because there are several unconformities in the Grand Canyon strata only provide a partial record of geologic time. The time scale in this case is on the right vertically with gaps noted in the record. Geologists like to compare different stratigraphic columns from different areas to determine the spatial, areal, or geographic extent of the different strata and the relationships between them. So rock types and fossils are matched at different locations and depths beneath the surface. And in this case here, the Hamilton conglomerate is the marker bed, is known as the marker bed because it's present in all of the stratigraphic columns. From it, the correlations were drawn. A geologic column is a composite stratigraphic column that symbolizes the entirety of Earth's history. So we know that stratigraphy at many locations worldwide correlated to develop this geologic column.